The Venerable Archbishop Fulton Sheen said, "Keep your eyes on the crucifix, for Jesus without the cross is a man without a mission, and the cross without Jesus is a burden without a reliever." Jesus Christ was born for one mission, one purpose, and for one reason alone, and that is to lay down his life for you and for me. My name is Raymond Valiente, host of the Reignite Your Faith series. Dr. Timothy Millea is a practicing orthopedic surgeon located in Bettendorf, Iowa. He graduated from the University of South Alabama College of Medicine and completed his orthopedic surgery residency and spine surgery fellowship training at Southern Illinois University. He is board certified by the American Board of Orthopedic Surgery, a member of the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, and the North American Spine Society. He is also a member of the Catholic Medical Association and serves on the board of directors. Today, in part one of this special series, Dr. Millea presents his research about Jesus' suffering, passion, and death from a theological, biblical, and medical perspective. I hope you'll gain more insight, understanding, and appreciation about this important Christian event and why this particular Friday of Holy Week is called Good Friday.
Dr. Millea, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Raymond. It's a real pleasure. It's a blessing and a privilege to be here. This is a topic that is near and dear to me, and not as much through my entire life as I wish it had been. I appreciate the introduction. If I didn't know the guy you were talking about, I think he sounded pretty reasonable. But I'm originally from a tiny little farm town on the Iowa-Minnesota border. And back in the 70s, mid-70s, when I graduated high school, nobody in my family had gone to college. Mm-hmm. And so I was kind of the black sheep. I ended up becoming a physical therapist. It was something that was on my mind and my heart since early in high school. And in St. Louis, which the winter was warmer than what I was used to. And so my next wild decision, which was irrational to my family, was I was going to move as far south as I could. And because it's warmer there, I end up on the Gulf Coast of Alabama in Mobile. Don't know anybody, don't have two dimes to rub together. My first job.
Wait, cold turkey, basically.
Basically, exactly right. And it first day of on the job, I walk into the physical therapy department, and sure enough, the lady that's working there ends up being my wife about 14 months later. So the God draws straight on our crooked lines. That was it. Never even intending to no thoughts whatsoever of medical school. And after about 6 months of marriage, that is when that calling came up. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, as any man should, you marry above yourself. You have a co-pilot who is really your pilot, and your navigator and your tactician and everything else. So I was blessed with Beth for this past, we just hit 40 years.
Oh, congratulations.
And our 5 kids. And as of last night, we just found out we're expecting our 12th grandchild.
Wow.
So, and the Passion and Crucifixion as a cradle Catholic, I mean, you don't avoid it. You can't avoid it. You shouldn't avoid it. And as I get into the talk, when this happened, when this really kind of grabbed me, I was in my last year of medical school. I was just about to find out where I was going to be doing my residency. That is an incredible period of angst and anxiety. Mm-hmm. I'm married. I've got 2 kids, a third on the way. I've had no income for 4 years. I'm living on student loans. We're going to move somewhere in the lower 48 states, and we don't know where. And an article in the American Medical Association Journal about this that I'll discuss in the talk came up, and it was a real kick in the gut. This is real. This, because it was put in a scientific way.
Yeah.
A medical approach that really caught my attention at the right time in my life. And it just been kind of sitting there. And it was about 10, 12 years ago that I really took some time to dig in a little bit deeper. So what this talk is continually an evolution. It is, to say that it's the deepest topic in the history of mankind it's the biggest, the deepest, the most important, unavoidable topic in the history of mankind. So it is certainly worth the work, and I hope the presentation is worth the time and the viewing.
Well, Dr. Millea, I'm looking forward to this presentation, so I'll let you take it away from here.
All right. Today I want to spend some time talking about the most important event that occurred in the history of the world, the history of from the creation of the universe to now and until forever. This is an eternal story that happened at one point in time, but it began happening and it continues to happen. And our appreciation of this cannot be exaggerated. Okay. Now, there often is the question arises, why is this an important topic, and why is it important to talk about? Well, there are various and quite significant factors that come into play. You can look at this from a multitude of perspectives. My original intent with this, when I really delved into this topic, was truly from a medical standpoint, a scientific and medical standpoint. Doing it from a theological standpoint is unavoidable. You can look at this as a historical event, which indeed it was, and the documentation, the evidence for this event is quite clear. And interestingly, there's a bit of a legal perspective to this we'll touch on briefly during the talk, and the symbolic and prophetic side of this. And as I've evolved this talk over the past decade or so, symbolism was important, but I'm looking at this more of a prophetic. I want to make a really good case for the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And ultimately, the ulterior motive initially was a personal thing. And that relates to March of 1986. At that point in time, I was that fourth-year medical student. I was within a week of finding out where I was going to be doing my residency with my wife and children, which is a big step. Your career really depends upon that, where your training's at. And shortly before I found that out, this article appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And it's a fascinating article, and it really caught my heart, caught my attention. Interestingly, the authors are all from Rochester, Minnesota. One of the authors is a pathologist at the Mayo Clinic. Another is a medical illustrator, and the third is a Methodist minister from Rochester. So this was really a good glimpse of trying to picture with the illustrations what it might have been like, and also looking at it from a theological standpoint, from the minister's standpoint, as well as the pathologist, the forensic standpoint. And throughout the talk, you'll see, when you see some black and white drawings, just illustrations, those are taken directly from this article. And from a medical standpoint, as far as a true scientific look at it, really the first real treatise on this was by Lipsius in the late 16th century, a Dutch scientist who discussed the crucifixion and the physical side of it. In more recent times, Stroud's treatise, the treatise on the physical cause of the death of Christ from the mid-1800s, is really the first medical bent. Now, between Lipsius and Stroud, became much more acquainted with anatomy, some physiology understanding, being able to look at this as a true CSI case, a cause of death type of case. And I would recommend this book if anyone really wants to have a basis to start with. Barbet's book he published it first in the early 1950s. And Barbet is a French surgeon who really not only discussed this from a surgical and medical standpoint, but it's a very good review of the literature dating back over the preceding century and a half. And it's continuing to be reprinted, and I would recommend this. It has a little more flowery and soaring language than a typical medical text would, but it's a good blend. Barbet is a very devout man, and the combination of his love for Christ and for the church and this story makes for a very, very good read. Now, we need to talk about the subject and the life of Christ. Okay. We don't know when exactly, or even approximately when Christ was born, but it's reasonable to assume he was born between 6 BC and 4 BC, which always makes eyebrows go up because you think Christ was born before Christ.
Right.
Well, you have to keep in mind that the calendar that's utilized was developed 7-8 centuries after this.
Yep.
So, but to say that it was in that period of time is a reasonable assessment. Herod the Great died in 4 BC, and we know that, and he's also the one that ordered the killing of every male child 2 years and younger. So we've got this 2-year interval. And when Christ died, when did the crucifixion occur? The estimates, we know he was in his 30s. It would seem to be somewhere in the early 30s AD. If you look at Passover, which is when this happened, then in that period of time, the Jewish calendar would have been sometime in what our early April is. That time in the Jewish calendar was known as Nisan. That was the first month of their year. So between the 10th and 14th of Nisan. And I don't think it's coincidental that that is also known in the Hebrew known as Chodesh HaYashua, which means the month of salvation. So the timing was everything. The physical condition of Jesus. This is a kind of a fascinating thought experiment. What kind of shape was he in? Well, we know he wasn't royalty. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't in the priestly class. He didn't ride around on a horse. He wasn't in a carriage. He wasn't carried on a litter by servants. Everywhere he went, he walked. Other than the donkey riding into Jerusalem, everywhere he would have walked, or by boat for that matter. So not a simple, easy couch potato life. And if you take that information, if you go to the Shroud of Turin, and if you accept for this discussion's purposes, you accept that this is the burial cloth of Christ, well, estimates are it's a man who's about 5'10" and 175 pounds. So we think that that's above average size, height, weight for this period of time. There's some debate about that. I think it's interesting that if, the discussion we have nowadays about the BMI, what's your BMI? How do you gauge that? Well, 5'10", 175 in a man, your BMI is 25.1, which is the lowest end of the overweight category for BMI today. So I doubt there was an obesity epidemic in Jerusalem at that time. And we'll come back to this later, but a total blood volume, that's an important factor in anyone, but particularly in someone who is suffering. If you imagine 1.5 gallons of liquid, that's how much blood would have been in the body of a man this size. And to make this somewhat relative to today, the man of the shroud would have been about the same size as this man in his early 30s. And this is St. John Paul II, before he became a cardinal as a young priest. He was about 5'10" and 175 pounds. So we need to define another thing, and that is passion. Again, cradle Catholics, we grow up, all we hear about is the passion and the crucifixion. Crucifixion speaks for itself. Passion in the English language is quite a different meaning. Where does passion come from this? Well, it dates back to the Latin term patior, meaning to suffer, to allow, to submit. Basically, you know what you got to go through and you just allow it to happen. So it truly is the patior of Christ. He accepted what was happening. And I mentioned earlier the symbolism and the prophecies. Now, the Old Testament this is just a partial list
Mhm.
of the different books. About a third or more of the Old Testament books have references in there that seem to be very apropos to the Passion and Crucifixion story. But when it boils down to it, the most important thing of all of this is sacrifice, giving up for someone else, giving up for everyone else. If you go back in the Old Testament, Melchizedek meets Abraham, and he brings bread and wine as a sacrifice to the one high God.
Mhm.
You have Abel bringing his sacrifice, which is preferable to Cain's, and we know where that story led to.
Yeah.
And then you have Abraham ready to sacrifice Isaac. So doing what is intended to be done for the good of the other and to honor God is a theme that needs to be kept in mind throughout when you're listening to the Passion, when you're doing Stations of the Cross.
Mhm.
I put the word prophecies in quotes here. New Testament prophecies, New Testament writings should be contemporary. But reason I say prophecies, there are at least three instances in the Gospels, or three of the Gospels in several instances, when Jesus is talking to his disciples. He says at least this number of times,
Mhm.
I'm going to die, they're going to kill me, they're going to bury me, and I will rise in 3 days. So Old Testament prophecies, New Testament prophecies are very pertinent to this discussion. And the hard thing to do for anyone that is thinking about this, just contemplating, meditating on this episode, to imagine the scene, which it is impossible to put
Right.
yourself in that situation, but you imagine you are there and just think about the sights, the gore, the sounds, the emotion, the crowd of people. It is like being in the middle of a war zone.
Mhm.
It is essentially unimaginable for us, but if you can put yourself in that situation, and Gibson's movie certainly does help with that. It's a very eye-opening and very heart-rending experience, and it probably comes as close as anything can, unless we could time travel. And the impact of this also is that we're not talking about a long period of time. We're talking about 18 hours
Mhm.
that had the most dramatic impact on the course of history. And if you try to imagine, put yourself in the shoes of Christ, or in the sandals of Christ, what are you going to go through? Emotional stress, to be sure. Fully divine, fully human, but the human part, if you look at this from a human side, the spiritual torment. You have been abandoned. John is the only one that is there at the end. We don't know where John was, when Peter denied Christ, when we know John was next to Jesus at the table when Judas took off, but the only one that was around at the crucifixion site was John. There's no indication of any sleep that Jesus would have had, probably from early when he got up Thursday morning until he died.
Mhm.
There are multiple assaults, and even before Christ is on the Via Dolorosa, he's already walked 2.5 miles without anything to drink that we're aware of, without anything to eat, without any sleep. So this is a man that is really being broken down.
Mhm.
Now, Jerusalem at that point in time, estimates are very wide, but generally about 40, maybe 50,000 citizens in Jerusalem that are residents there. But because it was the meeting place, the center of Judaism, it's estimated that for festival periods like this, for Passover, up to 250,000 people are going to this city that is not very big. And it had to be crowded and smelly and chaotic and noisy. And on that Thursday night in the upper room at the Cenacle, where the Last Supper is held, is the first real part of this story. And at the Last Supper, which is described in John and Matthew's Gospels, We all know what happens there, the institution of the priesthood,
Mhm.
the institution of the Eucharist. And you have to, you go back to what we talked about earlier. Christ is telling the disciples, this is what's going to happen. He's telling them here, this is what is to be done. Was Judas the only one who really understood what was really happening? That obviously is an unanswerable question, but you get the sense from the Gospels that Judas was upset, not just simply because he betrayed him, but he really knew that he was on the wrong side of history as this unfolded.
Mhm.
The first trek they make, leaving the upper room, going to the garden, to the Gethsemane. Now, this would have been probably about 9 o'clock on that Thursday night, and it's not warm in Palestine at that time of year. And it's about a 1 mile walk out the city gate, down through the Kidron Valley, up to the Mount of Olives. We know that Christ turned to his disciples and said, wait here for me while I go pray. He goes a little farther up, what's commonly known as the Rock of Agony. The Church of All Nations is on the Mount of Olives, and this is what is legend holds it is the Rock of the Agony. In the Garden of Gethsemane is an olive grove, and it's quite likely that many of the olive trees that are there today were also there, alive at the time that Christ was there. And Gethsemane is derived from the Hebrew term gat shmanim, which means oil press, which applies to this throughout the Old Testament, New Testament, and even today. Baptisms and confirmations, oil is a symbol of the Holy Spirit. And relating back to the Psalms, the Spirit of God being crushed in the 34th Psalm, we know that Christ was in crisis at this because of the agony in the garden. In agony, this is the only time that this word is used in the Bible, and it's used in Luke's gospel. Agony is translated from the Greek word agonia, which means great fear, great anxiety. And clearly that was the emotional experience for Jesus in the garden. A lot of discussion over the years about hematohidrosis. And I know when I was a young teenager, high school, college, the parish priest we had, who was a very holy and very conservative gentleman, basically was of the impression that this was a metaphor. I was sweating so much, it was like I was bleeding. Well, because there was no medical documentation that this could happen, no proven documentation. Well, it can happen. This is also known in the literature as hematohidrosis, or in the Greek, thrombohematos. And it truly is bleeding through the skin, through the sweat glands, and the hair follicles. And good or bad, well, first off, it's very appropriate. The only place this is mentioned is in Luke's gospel. Luke was a physician, and Luke is the one who will investigate. He's going to make note of the things that have somewhat of an anatomic or physiologic source. And this is where one of the instances where I think cell phones have been a good thing, because since the advent of cell phones and selfies, there have been many, many more cases confirmed, people taking pictures and videos of themselves when this has happened. And there are even documented cases now, patients that have it occurs, and at the same time it's happening, a skin biopsy's been done. And it truly is bleeding through the skin and the structures in the skin. So it is real, it is a thing, and as the gospel truth, Christ experienced it. The story of Judas is a totally different topic. It is one of the relatively few instances where where all the Gospels discuss it. Now, after the garden, first place Christ goes is to the home of Annas. Now, Annas is an interesting character. Some years prior to this, he was the chief priest, the high priest. He was demoted, but Annas was not. He was not a very naive individual. He made sure that his sons and sons-in-law would take over the role of the high priest. So he always had a role in this. And we know that Christ was struck while there, as the soldiers that brought him to Annas accused him of being impertinent, of being rude to him, not answering him appropriately. And the home of Annas is very close to where the upper room was. So they've gone to the garden, and now they've gone to Annas. They've doubled back to where they were. Next door to Annas is where Caiaphas was. And Caiaphas was Annas' son-in-law. So whether this was a puppet and puppeteer type of relationship, we don't know, but it wouldn't be surprising. Mm-hmm. And in front of Caiaphas is really where the charge is leveled, that the high priest is accusing Christ of blasphemy. And in the original Greek, the words rapisma and kolaphizo are used. And there's this debate: was he slapped with an open hand? Was he punched with a closed fist? We don't know. Probably both, the way this story unfolds. And this occurred where Caiaphas's home it was also where Peter betrayed Christ, where he denied him the 3 times. And on the hillside in that area is a church called St. Peter in Gallicantu. And Gallicantu is the Latin word for cock's crow, for obvious reasons. Yeah. And one thing that's not detailed in the Gospels is the question of a sacred pit. And in Gibson's movie, there is that interval where Christ is below the floor. Was he lowered into a sacred pit? Well, at the Gallicantu church, there is this mural, and it's run by, I believe, French Franciscans. And at the bottom of the mural, it says, "On m'a mis en fosse profonde," which translated is, "I was put into a deep pit." And you see Christ here with a harness. And if you go back to the 88th Psalm, I won't read these completely, but I am among those in the pit. I'm a man without strength. I'm forsaken. I'm in the depths. I'm in the lowest pit. You've taken my friends from me. You made me an object of loathing. If you're in this pit and you know what's coming, and you think about Psalm 88, it's a very, very pertinent discussion of what is happening. So there are the first of 2 trials before the Sanhedrin. This occurs in the middle of the night, which we'll talk about in a moment. Mm-hmm. It's his first trial. He's been charged with blasphemy. He's convicted of blasphemy, both at night. And we know that he was assaulted at this point in time, as well as mocked, blindfolded, etc. And then the second trial happened probably right about daybreak or shortly thereafter. This took place within the temple. There is a small area in the temple known as the Chamber of Hewn Stones. And what you see on this illustration here is what it would have looked like. You've got 35 members on one side, 35 in the other, and the high priest, Caiaphas, would be at the head of the room. And in that, the Nasai, which would be Caiaphas, and then the Av Bet Din, who was essentially, you think about that like president and vice president. Now, some comments here briefly on the illegal part of this. This was the Jewish law, and the Jewish legal proceedings were very, you go back to Leviticus and the Pentateuch particularly, you know that there's very rigid obligations. If you look at the legal treatment of an accused, there were several areas that were not adhered to. Trials could only occur in the chamber, not in the high priest's palace. There were no trials allowed at particular times, including at night. The guilty sentence, the guilty verdict, was only pronounced the day after the trial. More than 2 or more witnesses, which were not allowed. No arrests at night. That was violated. Importantly, the Sanhedrin could investigate charges. They couldn't instigate the charges. And the charges were changed. We'll see that in just a moment. Christ had no defense that was allowed. And the Sanhedrin, we know that in the fortress of Antonia, where the mob is in front of Pilate, they know that they ask Pilate to crucify him because they can't do that, but they cannot pronounce a death sentence. So why did they do this? Well, I think we're all well aware. I mean, this is a threat to their authority. He was a revolutionary to both the Romans and to the Sanhedrin. But again, you go back to the Old Testament, and in the Book of Wisdom, you take what the Sanhedrin are thinking about Christ, their opinion of Christ, and you take what the Book of Wisdom says, it's like they wrote it themselves. We're going to wait for the righteous one. He annoys us. He opposes us. He reproaches us. He tells us we're violating our training. When Christ is calling them a brood of vipers, a bunch of hypocrites. He is the center of our thoughts. To see him is a hardship for us. So this is as if you had all of the members of the Sanhedrin in their little groups together, and they're talking about what do you think of this guy? And this would be almost exactly what they would be saying. Mm-hmm. So he's then taken to Pilate. Pilate is the procurator of Judea, a political position, not a religious position, but he's in the organizational chart for Caesar and trying to do a good job so he can get a promotion. The Romans could care less about the charge of blasphemy. A pagan, mythology-based religion, if it is a religion at all. Blasphemy means nothing to them. The religion of the Jews seems foolish to them. So this is when the Sanhedrin changed the charges. And they make the claim that Jesus said he was king of the Jews and that the Jews should not honor Caesar. So when Pilate realizes that there's a question of sedition or treason here, that he is anti-Caesar, that's a different story. He wants to keep his position. He wants to stay in Caesar's good graces. Anybody that challenges Caesar is, you at least need to investigate that and take care of the problem. However, Pilate, it's as if he really is trying to keep away from this situation. He's going to pass the buck on this one. Well, Jesus is a Galilean. Well, then he needs to go to Herod, who is the tetrarch of Judea, which includes the area where Jesus is from. Herod has heard about Jesus, and it really gets his hopes up. He wants to see something miraculous happen. He wants to see this wonder worker do his thing. Very disappointed. Ultimately, there's no change in the charges. This was a walk for really no significant change, and also no evidence that he was mistreated other than the usual mockery while he was in front of Herod. So he's back to see Pontius Pilate. And this is a very busy diagram of the city of Jerusalem, and all of the lines and arrows is the path that Christ had to walk through this whole episode. There's some of the church fathers, the early literature, that while going from Herod back to Pilate and before the scourging, that Christ was beaten as well. I think most of us are familiar with caning, which we still see it sometimes. To be staved, a stave is a board. And if you think about how a barrel is made, it's that plank that's used as the side of the barrel. So you're literally being beaten with a board, beaten with a 1x4 or 1x6. The scourging itself, this is the part that is really, really difficult to imagine and impossible to really appreciate in its cruelty. The fortress of Antonia is where this would have occurred, often called today the Lithostratos. So even this day, on the floor of this, you can see where the floor was marked by the Roman soldiers for games that they would play. And the scourging was at least the third, probably the fourth assault that Christ had to sustain. He's already walked the 2.5 miles, no evidence of sleep, no evidence he's had anything to drink. And what you see in Caravaggio's painting here is most likely the way that it took place in this position. In the Roman protocol for scourging, you have to think like a Roman army officer. the Romans were all about efficiency and effectiveness. Scourging was not new. Scourging had been going on for 800 years prior to this. And it was a routine preliminary to anyone being executed. And the only ones excluded from scourging were women, senators, or soldiers, unless a soldier made the unfortunate choice to desert and then join the enemy. So he would be scourged and then executed. There were a variety of instruments used for this. The virga, which is a switch, a branch from a tree that is used. If you attach small little cords to the end of a virga, and you put some blunt ends on it or quills, like from an ostrich feather, that were somewhat sharp, but not terribly sharp. And a third thing, probably not very common, was what's often called a Spanish cord. There's some discussion that when Christ was in the temple, throwing out everybody in the temple, there's a comment that he may have used a Spanish cord at that point in time. But for Christ, by all indications, the instrument used would be known as the flagrum. And the flagrum was a much more diabolical instrument. It was usually several leather cords up to 2 feet long. And on the cords were metal balls, usually made of lead, and multiple sharp objects made of bone or glass or rock. And this was as I say, diabolical instrument. It was intended to produce contusions. And in a contusion, what happens is that the tissue becomes not only damaged, but softens. And then you have softer tissue that is easier to cut. So you have the worst of both things going on. And in the Greek literature, the word dorontes is often used. And the translation for that is to skin or to thrash. And clearly, that's what the flagrum would accomplish. And again, put yourself in the Roman soldier's mentality. This is a military exercise. You have a quaterno. You have the 4 soldiers doing this, led by the centurion with the rather gruesome name of the exactor mortis. And the scourging was done by 2 of the soldiers, known as the lictors. And they would stand usually behind, as you would see in Gibson's movie, alternating between the 2. And the lictors, they were usually the ones that determined how bad do we want to make this. And there was also scourging done under Jewish law. You could be scourged as a punishment among the Jews. However, the Jewish law had a limit of 40 minus 1, 39 lashes, 13 to the chest, 13 to each shoulder, and then you're done. This was not a Jewish scourging. And the Romans had the intention. This was sending a message, not just to the victim, but to the people watching it as well. And the scourging of Jesus, as well as the crucifixion, definitely in public for wide viewing. The Romans were looking for maximal public relations impact. They've got 250,000 people there that don't know anything about this guy, don't know anything about the situation, except he was in trouble with the Romans. So they're going to send a message to all these Jews that really don't want the Romans there. So it is, and we know from the ancient Greeks, Seneca and others, his scourging was particularly harsh. And again, if you relate this to the shroud, if it is the cloth, the burial cloth of Christ, nearly 400 total marks that are on the shroud consistent with damage to the skin. And the bleeding from that many open areas would have been quite profound.